Keanu Reeves walked into a quiet small-town diner and was publicly denied service. But instead of walking away in anger, he did something no one saw coming. Within days, the entire town was turned upside down. And what happened next left even his harshest critics in shock. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows over the quiet streets of Maple Creek, a small town that seemed frozen in time. Its charm was simple: red brick buildings, mom-and-pop shops, and an old-fashioned diner that sat on the corner of Main Street. The sign above the door read, "Maple Creek Diner," its letters faded but still inviting. Keanu Reeves pulled his motorcycle into the parking space just outside. He cut the engine, the sudden silence almost startling, and swung his leg over the bike with practiced ease. Dressed in a simple black t-shirt, faded jeans, and worn boots, he didn't look like a Hollywood star. He looked like any other traveler, stopping for a meal on a long ride. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair, and took a quiet moment before walking toward the door. He wasn't looking for attention, far from it. Keanu had been traveling solo for weeks, searching for a break from the noise of his public life. Maple Creek had seemed like the perfect place to find it. As he entered the diner, a small bell chimed above the door. Heads turned, small-town curiosity, but quickly turned back, except for one pair of eyes. Talia Reynolds, the young waitress working the mid-afternoon shift, froze with a coffee pot in hand. Her gaze widened in recognition. She took a breath and tried to act casual, setting the pot down and smoothing her apron. She approached Keanu's table slowly, as if approaching a dream she didn't want to wake from. "Good afternoon," she greeted with a soft smile. "Welcome to Maple Creek Diner. What can I get you?" Keanu smiled politely. "Coffee, please. Black." Talia nodded. "Coming right up." She disappeared behind the counter, pouring the coffee with a shaking hand. She'd seen celebrities on TV before, but never in real life, let alone one sitting quietly at a table in her own diner. As Talia returned with a cup of steaming coffee, the atmosphere inside the diner shifted. A quiet murmur swept through the other tables, and heads turned once again, some whispering behind raised menus. Most people in Maple Creek were polite enough to leave celebrities alone, but not everyone. From behind the counter, Melissa Hargrove watched the scene unfold. Melissa was the owner of Maple Creek Diner, a woman in her mid-50s with sharp eyes and a jaw set from years of hard choices. She had built the diner from nothing, poured her life into it, and she had rules about who she welcomed inside. As she wiped down a clean countertop with deliberate movements, her gaze never left Keanu. The easy smile he gave Talia, the quiet presence he carried, it rubbed her the wrong way. A few days earlier, Melissa had read about Keanu taking a public stance on a polarizing issue. She had disagreed with it, strongly. In her mind, some lines shouldn't be crossed, not even by the rich and famous. Setting her rag aside, Melissa straightened her apron and moved from behind the counter. She approached Keanu's table with purposeful steps, the heels of her shoes clicking against the worn tile floor. Keanu looked up, his expression neutral but welcoming. He nodded slightly as she approached. "Hi," he said simply. Melissa didn't return the greeting. She drew in a breath. "Mr. Reeves," she began, her voice low and measured, "I know who you are." He nodded once. "I'm just here for lunch." Melissa shook her head. "Not today." For a moment there was silence between them. Talia, watching from behind the counter, felt her stomach tighten. "I'm sorry?" Keanu asked, not defensive, simply confused. "I can't serve you," Melissa said quietly but firmly. "Not after what you said the other day. We don't welcome people who share those views." Keanu was silent for a moment. His eyes softened, understanding flashing behind them. He nodded slowly, not arguing, not trying to explain himself. His fingers curled lightly around the coffee cup, but he didn't take a sip. "I respect your decision," he said finally, his voice even and calm. "Thank you for being honest." Melissa stiffened. She wasn't expecting that. She had braced herself for a confrontation, maybe for him to storm out or make a scene. But he didn't. Keanu stood quietly, slipping his wallet from his back pocket. He placed a $10 bill on the table, even though he hadn't touched the coffee. "No hard feelings," he added gently. And then he turned toward the door, his movements graceful, unhurried. The bell above the door jingled softly as he left. For several seconds after the door swung shut, the diner remained eerily quiet. The customers sat in awkward silence, exchanging glances but saying nothing. Talia stood frozen, the coffee pot still in her hand. Her gaze flicked toward Melissa, who exhaled slowly but kept her face unreadable. Outside, Keanu walked back to his bike. He put on his helmet slowly, taking in the sight of the town around him. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow on the horizon. He didn't look back at the diner. Inside, Talia finally broke the silence. "That was Keanu Reeves," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. Melissa said nothing, but the weight of the moment hung thick in the air, as heavy as the late summer heat. And though Keanu had walked away quietly, the story was far from over. The rumble of Keanu Reeves' motorcycle faded into the distance as he left Maple Creek Diner behind him. The sun had dipped lower, casting long golden streaks across the narrow highway that stretched ahead. But inside his helmet, Keanu wasn't thinking about the road. His mind replayed the quiet moment with Melissa Hargrove, the owner who had looked him in the eye and refused him service. Not because of who he was as a person, not because of something he had done to her personally, but because of something he had said in a public forum, a stance he had taken on an issue he believed in. He had expected criticism before. He was used to trolls and tabloids, strangers forming opinions based on headlines and sound bites. But this had been different, personal, face to face. And yet, as he rode through the small town, he felt no bitterness, no anger. He slowed his bike near a scenic overlook, turned off the engine, and sat still for a long moment. The wind brushed gently against his face as he took off his helmet and rested it on the seat beside him. He stared at the quiet hills rolling out into the distance. Keanu exhaled. He knew he had a choice. He could ignore the incident, move on without ever mentioning Maple Creek again. No one would blame him. Or he could react, like so many others might. Air his grievance, call out Melissa's actions, let the internet take sides, and watch the drama unfold. But that wasn't who he was, not anymore. Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He opened his social media app, thumb hovering for a moment over the screen before he started typing. His fingers moved slowly at first, then with conviction. He read it once, twice, before pressing post. It read, "Stopped by Maple Creek Diner today. They have a strong sense of who they are, and I respect that. If you're passing through, give them a visit. Support local businesses." No anger, no sarcasm, just grace. He tucked his phone away, placed his helmet back on his head, and rode off down the highway. What Keanu didn't expect, what he couldn't have predicted, was what would happen next. By the time Keanu checked into his motel room for the night, the post had already begun to ripple across social media. His millions of followers were the first to see it, and they were confused. The comments came quickly at first. Wait, didn't they just refuse him service? Keanu is way too nice. Support a place that turned you away? Only Keanu would. What happened? Someone explain. Then came the wave of curiosity, and curiosity online spreads like wildfire. Within 2 hours, Maple Creek Diner was trending. By morning, Keanu's post had gone viral. News outlets picked it up, framing it as another example of Keanu Reeves' legendary kindness. Articles appeared with headlines like, "Keanu Reeves supports diner that refused him service. Class act. Reeves proves again why he's Hollywood's nicest star. A masterclass in grace from Keanu Reeves." Among the many reporters catching wind of the story was Camden Walsh, an ambitious journalist from Channel 8 News. Camden had been following Keanu's career for years, but this story intrigued him differently. There was something raw, human, and deeply timely about it. So, without hesitation, he packed his camera gear, jumped in his car, and headed straight for Maple Creek. Meanwhile, back at Maple Creek Diner, Melissa Hargrove stood in the center of her restaurant, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She watched the front door swing open again, and again, and again. More customers had walked in before noon than she'd seen in an entire week. And they weren't just locals. People from neighboring towns, out-of-state tourists, and even journalists had begun to pour in. Most had their phones out, snapping photos of the diner's red vinyl booths, its chalkboard specials, and, without subtlety, Melissa herself. It was surreal. The bell above the door chimed again. Melissa barely managed a nod at the newcomers before Talia rushed past her, coffee pot in hand, balancing plates on her arm. "Table 7's asking for more fries," Talia whispered as she hurried past, "and Table 3 wants to know if Keanu's coming back." Melissa sighed heavily but nodded. It was chaos. But for the first time in months, it was good chaos. The registers rang steadily. The tips were generous, and for the first time in a long while, they had to close early just to catch up on cleaning and restocking. Yet, beneath the success, something gnawed at Melissa. Why? Why would Keanu say something kind after she had turned him away? After she had deliberately chosen to make him feel unwelcome. Talia noticed Melissa's far-off expression as she wiped down a table late in the afternoon. "You okay, Mel?" Melissa blinked and shook herself from her thoughts. "Yeah, fine." But she wasn't fine. She was confused, and if she was being honest, she was ashamed. She had expected Keanu to react like others might, angrily, publicly. She had braced herself for backlash, maybe even vandalism, a smear campaign. She'd seen it happen before in other towns, other businesses. Instead, he had thanked them, promoted them, forgiven them. Melissa's hands trembled slightly as she poured herself a glass of water. She took a deep breath, staring at the line of customers still waiting for takeout orders. The buzz of conversation filled the room. "Did you see his post? I'm here because of him." What a class act. The words swirled in her mind. Later that evening, as the diner quieted and the last customers left, Talia sat down at the counter and opened her phone. She scrolled through Keanu's post again, her heart full of gratitude. She knew it wasn't her place, but she typed out a short message and sent it into the ether. "Thank you, Mr. Reeves. You didn't have to be kind, but you were, and it's changing things here. I hope you see this." She doubted he ever would, but somehow, just writing it felt right. As she looked around the now empty diner, Talia noticed Melissa standing by the window, staring out at the street beyond. The glow of the neon sign reflected faintly in Melissa's eyes. Something in her expression had softened, as if the weight she carried had finally cracked. Just a little. "Melissa?" Talia asked softly. Melissa didn't answer at first. She turned slowly and walked toward the counter, her gaze thoughtful. "I think," Melissa said slowly, "we need to talk." Talia tilted her head. "About what?" Melissa exhaled, rubbing her hands over her apron. "About making things right." And for the first time since Keanu had walked through the door, Melissa meant it. The sun was setting behind Maple Creek, casting an orange glow over the hills and rooftops of the quiet town. Inside the Maple Creek Diner, Melissa Hargrove watched through the front windows as the last group of customers left, laughing and chatting about their meals. She stood at the register counting the day's earnings, but the numbers in front of her were blurry, not because of exhaustion, though she was tired, but because her heart felt heavier with each passing moment. The diner had been busy all day, busier than it had been in years. Plates had flown out of the kitchen, coffee cups stayed full, and the tip jars were heavier than they'd ever been. The hum of conversation had filled the small space, from morning until night. And it was all because of Keanu Reeves. Melissa sighed, setting down the stack of bills. The success should have made her proud, but instead, she felt hollow. She wiped her hands on her apron and turned off the neon "Open" sign. The streets outside were quiet now. The day was done. Yet something lingered in the air, something unresolved. Later that night, Melissa found herself sitting on the front porch of her small house on the edge of town, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. The stars twinkled faintly above, and the air smelled faintly of lilacs from Talia Reynolds' garden next door. Eliza had lived in Maple Creek for as long as Melissa could remember. She was Talia's grandmother, a wise woman with soft gray hair and eyes that saw more than most people realized. Tonight, Melissa needed her wisdom more than ever. Eliza eased herself into the porch swing beside Melissa, carrying her own cup of tea. She didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. Melissa broke the silence. "I made a mistake." Eliza took a sip, then tilted her head slightly, waiting for Melissa to continue. "I shouldn't have turned him away," Melissa admitted quietly, her fingers tightening around her mug. I don't even know what I thought, that it was a stand I needed to take, that I was protecting something." She exhaled a shaky breath. "But all I did was close a door I didn't have the right to close." Eliza smiled faintly but said nothing. She let the silence stretch, as if giving Melissa space to hear herself. Melissa shook her head. "And now, he's helped us, helped me, and he never had to." Eliza set her cup on the table and folded her hands in her lap. "Melissa," she said softly, "do you know why Keanu Reeves is the man he is?" Melissa glanced at her, unsure how to respond. "It's because of his grandmother," Eliza continued. "Beverly Reeves. We all called her Mama Beverly. She was my best friend growing up." Melissa's brow furrowed. "I didn't know you knew her." Eliza chuckled. "Oh yes, we were inseparable. Shared peanut butter sandwiches on the playground, traded secrets by flashlight at sleepovers. Mama Beverly believed in kindness above all else. No matter how hard life got, she treated everyone with respect and compassion. It's who she was." Melissa stared into her tea, listening closely. "I see a lot of her in Keanu," Eliza said. "The way he handled what happened here? That's not an act. That's who he is. Because it's who she was." Melissa blinked back tears she hadn't expected. She thought of Keanu's quiet calm when she'd told him he wasn't welcome, his steady gaze, his gentle voice when he thanked her, even as she dismissed him. "He could have ruined me," Melissa whispered. "And instead, he brought people here, gave us a second chance." Eliza nodded. "Because forgiveness is powerful, but so is humility." Melissa turned toward her neighbor, the question heavy on her heart. "Do you think it's too late to make it right?" Eliza's gaze softened. "It's never too late." The next morning, Melissa walked into the diner earlier than usual. The place was quiet, the sun barely creeping through the blinds. She sat at one of the booths in the back with a pad of paper and a pen. Her hands shook slightly as she put pen to paper. She started the letter 3 times before she found the words. "Dear Mr. Reeves, I owe you an apology." She paused, staring at the simple sentence. It didn't feel like enough. She kept writing. "What I did was wrong. I made a judgment I shouldn't have, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. I let my own pride get in the way of decency, and still, you showed kindness I hadn't earned. I will never forget that." Melissa swallowed hard and continued. "Your grace has reminded me what this place is supposed to stand for. My grandmother started Maple Creek Diner as a place where everyone was welcome. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that. You helped me remember." She hesitated, tapping the pen against her chin. "If you ever find yourself in Maple Creek again, I would be honored if you would join me for dinner. I'd like the chance to thank you in person. Sincerely, Melissa Hargrove." She finished the letter with a slow breath and set the pen down. The folded paper felt heavier than it should as she placed it in an envelope. She wrote his name on the front but hesitated when it came time to write the address. "How do I even get this to him?" she muttered aloud. Talia walked in then, carrying a tray of silverware from the kitchen. She noticed Melissa holding the envelope and gave her a questioning look. Melissa sighed. "I wrote him a letter, but I don't know where to send it." Talia smiled gently and set the tray down. "I think I can help with that." Melissa blinked in surprise. "You can?" "I still have a contact from his team," Talia said. "When I thanked him on social media, one of his assistants messaged me back." She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her messages. "I can forward the letter to them." Melissa stared at her for a moment before sliding the envelope across the table. "Thank you." Talia picked it up carefully. "He'll appreciate this, I know he will." Melissa watched her go, feeling the weight in her chest begin to lift. That night she stood on the same porch where she had sat with Eliza and looked out at the stars. The sky was clear and the air smelled of lilacs again. For the first time in a long while, she felt hope. She had made a mistake, a big one, but she was trying to make it right, and sometimes that was enough to begin again. The days following Melissa's letter were tense ones, marked by a curious kind of anticipation that made time feel heavier. Every time the diner door creaked open, Melissa found herself hoping, then scolding herself for hoping. She worked alongside Talia, offering quiet thanks for each customer that walked through the door, knowing full well they were here because of Keanu Reeves. And then one ordinary afternoon, Talia approached her at the register, her phone in hand, her expression unreadable. "Hell," responded, Talia said softly. Melissa's breath caught. Keanu responded. Talia nodded. "His assistant said he read your letter himself." She paused, letting the words hang for a second. "And he accepts the invitation?" Melissa stood there for a moment, her hands flat on the countertop as if bracing herself. She felt a strange blend of relief and dread. Relief that he was willing to come back. Dread because now she had to face him, and she wanted to do it right. Melissa spent hours preparing. She refused to let anyone else cook for the private dinner. This was personal. After closing the diner early for the evening, she cleaned the space from corner to corner, polished the windows until they gleamed, and chose her grandmother's favorite linen tablecloth to cover one small table by the window. Camden Walsh from Channel 8 News had called earlier that day. He wanted to turn the dinner into a special segment on forgiveness and reconciliation. "Think about it," Camden had urged. "The whole town's watching, the world's watching." But Keanu had been clear when he accepted Melissa's invitation. No cameras, no reporters, no audience. He wanted this to be a conversation between two people, no spectacle, just truth. Melissa had agreed. At 7 p.m. sharp, the front door of Maple Creek Diner creaked open. Melissa wiped her hands nervously on her apron and turned. Keanu Reeves stood in the doorway. He was dressed in a simple gray t-shirt and dark jeans. No entourage, no assistants, just him. "Good evening," he said gently, giving a small nod. "Mr. Reeves," Melissa greeted, her voice shaking just slightly. "Thank you for coming." "Keanu," he corrected kindly as he stepped inside. "Just Keanu." They sat at the small table by the window, the room quiet, except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Outside, the last light of day was fading. Melissa poured them both coffee, freshly brewed, her best blend, and set a plate of homemade cornbread between them. "I'm glad you came," Melissa began, searching his face for any sign of resentment. She found none. "I'm glad you asked," Keanu replied, his expression open, calm. For a moment, silence stretched between them, comfortable but fragile. Melissa took a breath. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. I was wrong to judge you. I made assumptions based on things I thought I knew, and I treated you unfairly." Keanu nodded, listening. He didn't interrupt. "I thought I was doing what was right," Melissa continued, the words tumbling out faster now, "but I was really just holding on to fear. I've run this place for years, through good times and bad, and lately, it's been mostly bad." She sighed. I was angry. I let that cloud my judgment. And you didn't deserve that. Keanu sat back in his chair, hands wrapped loosely around his coffee cup. We all make mistakes, he said quietly. What matters is what we do after. Melissa looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding band around her finger. You could have ruined me, she said softly, but instead you helped. Why? Keanu smiled faintly. My grandmother used to say that kindness costs nothing but can mean everything. His gaze drifted for a moment, as if remembering something long ago. Mama Beverly, she believed in second chances, in giving people room to grow. Melissa smiled at the name. Eliza told me about her, said you two were close. Keanu's smile deepened. She was my safe place growing up. When things were hard, she reminded me that people can change, that holding on to anger only makes things heavier. Melissa exhaled slowly. I think I'm just starting to understand that. They ate quietly for a while. Melissa had made her best chicken pot pie, the recipe handed down from her grandmother. Keanu ate with quiet appreciation, complimenting the crust and asking about the herbs she used in the filling. Conversation gradually turned to lighter things. Maple Creek's history, the best fishing spots nearby, Keanu's favorite roadside diners from his travels. Melissa found herself laughing more than she expected, surprised by how easy he was to talk to. After clearing the plates, Melissa brought out a small dessert, a peach cobbler she'd baked that afternoon. She set it down in front of him with a smile. My grandmother's recipe, she said. She swore by fresh peaches, even in winter. Keanu chuckled, taking a bite. Delicious, he said. Mama Beverly would have approved. Melissa's eyes stung unexpectedly. She blinked hard and set down her fork. I wish I'd met her. You'd have liked her, Keanu said. She was stubborn, like you, but always led with her heart. They sat quietly for a few moments. Then Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. He slid it across the table. What's this? Melissa asked. Contact information for a community investment fund, Keanu said. They focus on revitalizing small towns and family businesses. I've worked with them before. If you're interested, they can help you expand the diner. Maybe even add outdoor seating. Melissa stared at the card, speechless. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything, Keanu said gently. Just consider it. Melissa nodded, slipping the card into her pocket like a precious token. As they stood to leave, Keanu pulled out his wallet and left a crisp $100 bill under his coffee cup. For Talia, he said. She was kind when it mattered. Melissa smiled. She's the best of us. Keanu gave a slow nod. Then you've got something to be proud of. They walked together to the door. Melissa opened it for him, feeling the cool night air drift in. Thank you, Keanu, she said softly. He turned to her with that calm, thoughtful look she was beginning to recognize as his signature. Thank you, Melissa. And with that, he stepped out into the night, disappearing down the quiet street. Melissa stood in the doorway for a long time after he left, breathing in the cool air. For the first time in years, the weight on her chest felt lighter. The diner behind her wasn't just a building. It was a place where second chances lived. The days following Keanu Reeves' quiet dinner with Melissa Hargrove were unlike anything Maple Creek had experienced in years. The old town, known more for its dusty storefronts and long-forgotten charm, now buzzed with an energy that felt almost electric. Yet, for Melissa, something even more remarkable was happening, something she hadn't expected. It started with a phone call. Talia answered the landline while Melissa was busy filling salt shakers at the counter. Maple Creek Diner, this is Talia, she greeted, balancing the phone between her ear and shoulder. There was a pause. Melissa, Talia said, lowering the phone. It's someone from the Maple Grove Investment Fund? Melissa blinked, confused. Who? Talia handed her the receiver, wide-eyed. Melissa pressed it to her ear hesitantly. This is Melissa Hargrove. Ms. Hargrove, a professional voice replied, warm but direct. I'm calling on behalf of the Maple Grove Sustainable Investment Fund. Mr. Reeves referred your diner to us personally." For a moment, Melissa forgot how to breathe. He what?" The voice chuckled. "He spoke very highly of your diner, its history, and your recent commitment to bringing people together. We've reviewed the information he provided, and we're pleased to offer you an initial grant for renovations, as well as a support package for staff development and community events." Melissa clutched the phone tighter. This has to be a mistake." "It's no mistake, Ms. Hargrove," the voice assured. "We believe Maple Creek Diner can be an important gathering place for your community. We're ready to help you make that happen." By the time Melissa hung up the phone, her hands were shaking. Talia stood across from her, both curious and nervous. "What did they say?" Melissa's mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. Then, with tears gathering in her eyes, she managed, "They're funding us." The following days were a whirlwind. Representatives from the investment fund arrived in town, walking through the diner, asking respectful but pointed questions about the building's history and the town's needs. Their focus wasn't just on profit, it was about sustainability, community, and long-term growth. "They're going to fix the roof," Talia whispered one morning as she read the proposal spread across the counter, "and add outdoor seating. Look, they want to host community events every month." Melissa sat quietly, taking it all in. She'd spent years patching leaks herself, scrounging money to keep the lights on. Now, experts were planning to renovate the space with care and respect for its history, while also ensuring it became a welcoming place for everyone in Maple Creek. It wasn't just the diner. Word spread quickly that Keanu's recommendation was bringing attention to other small businesses in town. The hardware store saw new inventory. The bakery, which had been struggling for years, got a small business loan. Even the old movie theater announced it would reopen after a decade of darkness. And through it all, Keanu Reeves stayed quiet. He didn't return for any public events. He didn't give interviews. But his fingerprints were everywhere. Melissa caught Talia smiling at her one evening as they polished silverware. "What?" Melissa asked. "You're different," Talia replied. "Happier." Melissa thought about it and found herself smiling too. "I feel different." A month later, the grand reopening of Maple Creek Diner was set. It wasn't fancy, nothing in Maple Creek was, but it was warm and welcoming, just as Melissa and Talia had planned. Colorful banners hung from the awnings. Tables had been set up outside, shaded by bright umbrellas. The new outdoor seating sparkled under the soft glow of string lights. Inside, the diner had been transformed, new booths, polished floors, and an air of fresh hope. The whole town turned out. Families, farmers, shopkeepers, people Melissa hadn't seen in years came back to support the diner. Even Camden Walsh returned, though he respected Melissa's earlier request for no coverage during the private dinner with Keanu. This time, she allowed him to film the event. It was, after all, a celebration for the community. Melissa stood on the small stage they'd set up by the front steps. She wore a simple blue dress and clutched the microphone tightly. Talia stood beside her, a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Thank you all for being here," Melissa began. Her voice trembled slightly, but she steadied herself. "I've made mistakes. I let fear and judgment get in the way of what this diner should always have stood for: welcome, kindness, and community." There was a murmur of agreement in the crowd. Faces familiar and new nodded back at her. "This isn't just about a fresh coat of paint or new menus," she continued. "This is about starting over. About opening our doors to everyone, no matter who they are or what they believe." The applause was gentle but genuine. Melissa stepped back, gesturing for Talia Reynolds to join her. The elderly woman took the microphone with surprising strength in her voice. "I've known Melissa since she was a little girl," Eliza began. "And I knew Mama Beverly, Keanu's grandmother, even before that. Both of them taught me something important. That kindness can outlast fear. That forgiveness is a gift we give ourselves as much as others." Eliza's voice softened. "Today isn't just about the diner reopening. It's about reopening our hearts." The crowd applauded again, louder this time. As the day gave way to evening, the diner was filled with laughter and conversation. Kids played in the parking lot, couples sipped coffee at tables outside, and old friends caught up on lost time. Melissa stood behind the counter at one point, watching it all with quiet satisfaction. Talia appeared beside her, holding 2 mugs of coffee. "Thought you might need this," she said with a grin. Melissa chuckled and accepted the mug. "Thanks." She sipped her coffee and glanced toward the horizon. "Think he'll ever come back?" she asked. Talia shrugged. "Maybe, but even if he doesn't, he's here." Melissa nodded. "Yeah, he is." Later that evening, as they locked up and cleaned the last tables, a simple bouquet of flowers was delivered to the door. No card, no note. But the delivery driver, a local kid named Benji, grinned knowingly. "Benji said you'd know who they're from," Benji said before hopping back on his bike. Melissa placed the flowers, yellow tulips and white daisies, in a mason jar on the counter. She didn't need a note to know. Keanu had been part of their journey even when he wasn't there. And as she turned off the diner lights that night, she whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude. Not just for him, but for second chances. The grand reopening of the Maple Creek Diner had only been the beginning. What followed was something far bigger than Melissa Hargrove or Talia Reynolds had ever dreamed. As the weeks turned into months, a quiet but profound transformation unfolded in Maple Creek, one that reshaped not only the diner but the entire town. It started small. Families who had long avoided the diner because of its old reputation as a local's noli spot now wandered in. Travelers passing through stopped after hearing whispers about the place Keanu Reeves mentioned. Camden Walsh's second feature on Channel 8 News had aired nationally, highlighting how one act of kindness and forgiveness had ignited a town's revival. Soon, journalists from bigger networks arrived, intrigued by the feel-good story in a time when such stories felt rare. The diner, once nearly empty on most days, now hummed with life. There was an energy about the place, a warmth that had less to do with the upgraded lighting and more with the sense of belonging people felt when they walked through the door. Melissa stood behind the counter one morning, watching a young couple feed their infant at a booth by the window. Across the room, 2 elderly men played chess over steaming cups of coffee. At a long table near the back, students from the high school worked on laptops, their discussions low but animated. Talia appeared at her side, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Full house," she said with a grin. Melissa nodded, pride softening her usual firm expression. "It's a good sight." But it wasn't just about a busy diner. The success of Maple Creek Diner sparked something deeper in town. The bakery reopened under new ownership, a young couple who had once dreamed of starting their own cafe before financial troubles forced them to leave town. The bookstore next door, which had shut its doors 3 years prior, reopened. After securing a grant Melissa quietly recommended through Keanu's investment fund contacts, even the hardware store expanded, hiring 2 new employees and hosting weekend workshops on home repairs. And then there was the park. Once neglected and overgrown, it became a centerpiece of the town's revival. Talia, inspired by the diner's transformation, organized monthly community events there, charity picnics, open mic nights, and holiday fairs that drew visitors from neighboring counties. One warm Saturday afternoon, Melissa stood on the freshly cut grass of Maple Creek Park and watched children run through a maze of hay bales at the fall festival. Talia was managing the bake sale booth, laughing with some of the other volunteers. Nearby, Eliza Reynolds sat in a folding chair, crocheting and watching the scene unfold with a peaceful smile. Melissa walked over and sat beside her oldest friend. "You were right," Melissa said softly. Eliza's fingers never stopped moving. "About what, dear?" "That forgiveness was worth it," Melissa replied, her throat tightening with emotion. "That it wasn't just about saying sorry, it was about doing something better afterward." Eliza chuckled. "You had it in you all along. You just needed a little nudge." Melissa smiled. She had changed, there was no doubt about that, and she owed so much of it to Keanu Reeves' grace and quiet strength. It wasn't long before Camden Walsh returned. His earlier stories had captured viewers' attention, and now the national networks wanted a follow-up. "We've had people from as far as New York and San Francisco call us," Camden explained as he set up his camera in the diner one afternoon. "They want to know how this sleepy town became a symbol of hope." Melissa blushed at the attention, but allowed the interview. "We're not doing anything special," she insisted as they filmed her preparing coffee behind the counter. "We're just treating people like they should be treated." Camden smiled. "That's exactly why it's special." The segment aired 2 days later, showing clips of the revamped diner, the town events, and interviews with residents. It highlighted the diner's new motto, printed on a sign over the door: "Everyone's welcome at Maple Creek." The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from across the country, some praising Melissa for her courage, others sharing personal stories of reconciliation and healing inspired by the diner's story. One chilly morning in early winter, Talia was restocking syrup bottles when she spotted a familiar figure outside the window. He stood quietly in his usual black jacket, hands in his pockets, sunglasses perched low on his nose despite the overcast sky. Talia's heart leapt. "Melissa," she whispered, nearly knocking over the syrup tray. Melissa followed her gaze and immediately recognized him. "Keanu," she murmured. He stepped through the door, nodding politely at the other patrons as they turned to stare. Despite his fame, there was something humble about him, as if he were just another neighbor dropping by for breakfast. Melissa wiped her hands on her apron and approached. "Welcome back," she greeted softly. Keanu smiled faintly. "I was passing through, thought I'd stop by." "Your usual table's open," Talia blurted, then flushed. "I mean, if you'd like." Keanu nodded graciously. "I'd like that." They served him coffee and apple pie, Eliza's recipe, Talia explained proudly. Keanu took a bite, savoring the taste, then smiled. "It's just like Mama Beverly used to make." Eliza herself shuffled over later that afternoon, her cane tapping against the floor. Keanu stood to greet her, bending slightly to hug her carefully. "It's been too long," Eliza said, her eyes glimmering. They sat together for an hour, swapping stories about their grandmothers, their shared memories of childhood summers spent in neighboring towns, and how those simpler times had taught them the value of kindness and community. As Keanu stood to leave, Eliza held his hand in both of hers. "You've done good, young man," she said. "You made Beverly proud." He smiled softly. "Thank you." A week later, something unexpected happened. A motorcycle rumbled into town, drawing curious glances from pedestrians. The rider parked outside the diner and removed his helmet, revealing a familiar face. Jesse. Melissa watched through the window as Talia greeted him outside. They talked quietly, Jesse shifting uncomfortably at first, but Talia's patient smile eventually relaxed him. Inside the diner, Jesse glanced around, taking in the changes. "Place looks different," he said. Melissa crossed her arms but nodded. "It is." Jesse cleared his throat. I'm looking for work," he admitted. "Thought maybe there's room for someone who wants to start over." Melissa studied him for a long moment. She saw something different in his eyes now. Humility, perhaps even hope. "We have a dishwasher job," she offered. Jesse smiled faintly. "I'll take it." Over time, Jesse became part of the team. He worked hard, kept to himself at first, but slowly opened up. He even started helping at Talia's community events, surprising everyone, including himself. By spring, the diner's outdoor patio bloomed with flowers and laughter. Keanu's quiet involvement had sparked not just a business revival, but a cultural one. Maple Creek was thriving. One afternoon, Keanu returned once more, this time without fanfare. He sat quietly with Melissa and Talia, enjoying coffee and watching families stroll through town. "You changed this place," Melissa said quietly. Keanu shook his head. "You did." They sat in peaceful silence until Melissa asked, "Will you ever tell the full story?" Keanu chuckled. "It's not my story. It's all of ours." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, Keanu stood and offered a quiet farewell. "Take care of this place," he said. Melissa nodded. "We will." And they did. The letter took Melissa 3 days to write. Each morning she sat at the small oak desk in the corner of her living room, pen in hand, staring at the blank page. She had never thought herself a writer. Words didn't come easily for someone who had spent her life running a business, wiping counters, managing staff, and keeping the lights on. But this was different. This wasn't just an apology, it was a reckoning, and it had to come from her heart. By the 4th morning, the words finally came. She wrote about her mistakes, not just the moment she refused to serve Keanu Reeves, but the years of letting judgment cloud her vision. She described how her fear of losing what little she had left had hardened her, how the struggles of keeping the diner afloat had made her suspicious of anything new or different, but mostly she wrote about the lesson she had learned, that true strength came not from standing firm in pride, but from finding the courage to admit when you were wrong. Melissa ended the letter with a heartfelt thank you to Keanu Reeves. She wrote about his grace, his decision not to fight back with anger, and the way his kindness had sparked something far bigger than either of them could have imagined. She urged anyone who read her words to lead with empathy, not judgment, to listen before making assumptions, to forgive. When she finished, she brought the letter to Eliza's house. Talia opened the door with a smile that faltered when she saw the papers in Melissa's hands. "May I?" Melissa asked. Talia nodded and stepped aside. They sat together in the living room, the same spot where they had shared many quiet conversations over the last few months. Eliza sat in her chair, knitting needles resting in her lap. Though she dozed lightly, the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest was a comfort. Melissa read the letter aloud, her voice steady, though her hands shook. When she finished, Talia wiped her eyes and reached for her grandmother's hand. "She would be proud," Talia whispered. "I hope so," Melissa replied. "I'm going to send it to the papers tomorrow." And she did. The letter appeared first in the Maple Creek Gazette, then in Channel 8 News, and finally in national outlets. Readers from across the country praised Melissa's honesty and courage. Some admitted they had once been like her, quick to judge, slow to forgive. Others said they had needed to hear her story because they, too, were carrying regrets. Keanu Reeves shared the letter on his social media with a single caption. Sometimes the hardest lessons become the most important ones. Within minutes, the post was flooded with comments from people applauding Melissa's transformation. They spoke of second chances, of the power of grace, and of how one act of kindness had started a ripple effect that was still being felt. In the weeks that followed, Maple Creek Diner became more than just a place to eat. It became a symbol of healing. The once divided community now found common ground over coffee and pancakes. Conversations that had once been tense became lighter. Strangers sat together at communal tables, sharing stories. One afternoon, as Talia refilled a coffee cup, she paused at the window, watching the steady stream of people outside. "It's hard to believe," she said softly. "A year ago, this place was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking." Melissa smiled faintly from behind the counter. "I remember." "You think it would have been different if Keanu hadn't walked in that day?" Talia asked. Melissa considered it, then shook her head. "He was the spark, sure, but it was us who had to change, and we did." Talia nodded. She looked over at Eliza, resting peacefully in her favorite chair by the fireplace. She had slowed in recent months. Her sharp wit was softer now, her laughter quieter. But she was still the heart of their little world. The end came gently. Eliza passed away one spring morning, the sunlight pouring through the curtains, birdsong in the air. Talia held her hand until the very last breath. Melissa sat on Eliza's other side, tears streaming down her face, whispering "thank you" over and over again. The funeral was simple but beautiful. The entire town came. So did people from neighboring counties, even some visitors who had followed the diner's story and felt connected to it. Keanu Reeves arrived quietly, sitting in the back of the little chapel, his head bowed respectfully. Talia gave the eulogy, standing strong despite the weight of loss in her chest. She spoke of Eliza's wisdom, her compassion, and the unwavering belief that everyone deserved a second chance. She ended by telling a story about Eliza's childhood best friend, Mama Beverly, and how their friendship had echoed through generations. After the service, Keanu approached Talia and Melissa. He embraced them both in turn. "She was a remarkable woman," he said. "She was," Talia replied softly. Later that afternoon, Keanu brought them to the park. "I've been working on something," he said. He gestured to a plot of land just beyond the playground, newly landscaped with young trees and garden beds. A bronze plaque stood in front of the path, in memory of Eliza Reynolds and Beverly Mama Reeves, two friends who believed in kindness above all. Talia covered her mouth, tears spilling over. Melissa rested a hand on her shoulder, holding back her own emotion. Keanu smiled gently. "This park is for them," he said, "and for everyone who believes we can do better." The park became a place where children played under the shade of trees planted in Eliza and Beverly's honor. People gathered there for story hours, poetry readings, and music performances. There was a bench beneath the largest tree, inscribed with Eliza's favorite saying, "Lead with empathy. Listen with an open heart." Months later, Melissa sat at the counter of the diner, writing thank you notes to the people who had donated to the park's creation. Talia stood at the door, greeting a group of new customers, tourists from out of state who had heard about Maple Creek and its message of healing. Jesse washed dishes in the back, humming quietly to himself. And Keanu Reeves? He came by from time to time, never making a show of it. Just a man enjoying a meal, sometimes chatting with Talia about her next community project, sometimes sharing a laugh with Melissa about how terrible her handwriting was. But every time he left, the town seemed a little brighter. One evening after closing, Melissa sat on the back steps of the diner. The stars stretched overhead, and the town lay quiet and content. Talia joined her, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "You thinking about Eliza?" she asked. "Always," Melissa said. "You think she'd be proud?" Talia pressed. Melissa smiled. "I think she already was." They sat in silence for a while, watching as the wind rustled through the trees in the park. Then Melissa spoke. "I used to think second chances were for other people," she said, "but I got mine." Talia raised her mug in a toast. "To second chances." Melissa clinked her cup against Talia's. "And to never forgetting what it took to get them." The sun hung low over Maple Creek, bathing the town in a soft golden glow as Keanu Reeves pulled his car into the newly paved lot beside the diner. He stepped out slowly, taking in the familiar sight of the Maple Creek diner. Except now, it had been transformed. Fresh paint in a warm cream color, windows gleaming in the light, flower boxes brimming with color beneath the sills. The old neon sign still flickered, open, but now it seemed brighter, as if it too had been given a second chance. Keanu walked to the front entrance, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. As he opened the door, a little bell jingled overhead, just like before. The difference was immediate. The room, once subdued and strained, now buzzed with the easy murmur of happy conversation. Families filled the booths. Children giggled over milkshakes at the counter, and neighbors greeted one another with familiarity that spoke of a town rebuilt. Melissa Hargrove was standing at the host stand, clipboard in hand. She glanced up as he entered, and for a heartbeat they just looked at each other. Then she smiled. Not the tight, cautious smile she once wore, but something warm, genuine. "Well, look who's back," she said. Keanu returned her smile. "Thought I'd stop by for a bite." Melissa set the clipboard down and stepped around the counter. "This time," she said, "I'm making sure you get the best seat in the house." He chuckled. "That's not necessary." She led him to a corner booth anyway, one with a window view of the little park down the street, the one with the bronze plaque and the children running beneath the new trees. The sight made something tighten in his chest, but in a good way. A reminder of what had changed and why. Melissa handed him a menu, though they both knew he didn't need it. "Same as last time?" she asked. He nodded. Coffee, black, and whatever your cook recommends." She gave him a knowing look. "Our new chef's special is the maple glazed salmon, caught fresh this morning." "Perfect," Keanu said. Melissa hesitated, then placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." "You did the hard part," Keanu replied. "No," Melissa said, shaking her head. "You gave me the chance to try." She left him then, moving smoothly through the room, refilling coffee cups and checking on guests. It was clear that she had found her rhythm again, but this time with more purpose, more heart. Talia approached not long after, carrying a small wrapped parcel in her hands. Her hair was tied back in a braid, and she wore an apron over her jeans and t-shirt. Her eyes sparkled as she slid into the booth opposite him. "We found something in Eliza's things," she said. "We thought you might like it." Keanu accepted the parcel with gentle hands, carefully peeling away the paper. Inside was an old, faded black and white photo. Two girls stood side by side in front of a farmhouse porch, laughing, arms slung around each other's shoulders like they had just shared a secret joke. "That's my grandmother," Talia said, pointing to the girl on the right. "And that's yours, Beverly." Keanu stared at the image, his fingers tracing the edges. He could see it, the kindness in Beverly's eyes, the fierce loyalty in her smile. He'd always known his grandmother was a force, but this was a moment captured in time, a friendship that had sparked something that still echoed today. "Thank you," he said, his voice rougher than he expected. Talia smiled. "I think they'd both be proud." He nodded, slipping the photo carefully into his inner jacket pocket. Lunch arrived and Keanu ate quietly, savoring the food and the peace. He was halfway through his salmon when a young boy approached his table. He was maybe 10 years old, his hair a mess of curls, his sneakers scuffed from play. "Excuse me," the boy said, clutching a notebook and pen. "Are you really Keanu Reeves?" Keanu smiled. "Last time I checked." The boy fidgeted for a second, then blurted out, "Can I ask you something? My dad says you're really strong, that you know karate and all kinds of stuff." Keanu laughed softly. "That's true." The boy's eyes widened. "How do you get strong like that?" Keanu set his fork down, thinking for a moment. Then he leaned forward, lowering his voice like he was sharing a secret. "Strength isn't about how hard you can hit," he said, "or how many fights you can win." The boy frowned. "It's not?" Keanu shook his head. "No. Strength is about knowing when to walk away, when to be kind, even when it's hard." The boy considered that, his young face scrunching up in concentration. Then he nodded as if it made perfect sense. "Thanks, Mr. Reeve." Keanu signed his notebook with a quick flourish, handed it back, and watched the boy run off toward a table where his family sat waiting. Melissa returned shortly after with a slice of homemade apple pie. "On the house," she said. He accepted it with a grin. "You're spoiling me. You earned it." They ate their desserts quietly, both watching as the diner hummed with life. Later that afternoon, Keanu stepped outside, lingering for a moment on the front porch of the diner. The town stretched before him, familiar and new at once. Families gathered in the park down the street, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Neighbors stood in front of shops, chatting over coffee. The bookstore next door had a sign advertising a poetry reading, and across the street, kids were painting a mural on a brick wall, bright colors spreading under their brushes. Melissa stood beside him. "It's hard to believe how far we've come," she said. "It started with you," Keanu replied. She shook her head. "It started with you walking away." He didn't argue. Maybe it was both. Maybe it was all of them. Keanu took a deep breath, the scent of maple and coffee on the air. He turned toward his car, slipping on his sunglasses. "Take care of this place," he said. Melissa smiled. "We will." As he drove away from Maple Creek, he glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The diner glowed softly in the evening light, people coming and going, the bell above the door jingling like music. The park beyond was full of life. Children playing, dogs barking, and elders sitting on benches watching it all unfold. Keanu's hand rested lightly on the photo in his jacket pocket. He thought of Mama Beverly and Eliza Reynolds, of their friendship and the legacy they had left behind. He thought of Melissa, of Talia, of Jesse finding his place, and of the boy who had asked him about strength. He smiled to himself. Sometimes the smallest acts made the biggest difference. A refusal met with kindness, an invitation accepted with grace, a second chance embraced. And as the road stretched out ahead, Keanu Reeves knew one thing for certain. It all started with one simple choice: kindness. As Keanu Reeves drove away from Maple Creek, his mind was quiet, but his heart was full. What had started as a simple stop for lunch had unfolded into something far greater, a lesson not just for others, but for himself as well. In a world often fueled by outrage and division, it's easy to react with anger, to harden your heart against those who misunderstand or judge you. But Keanu's choice that day at the Maple Creek Diner wasn't about proving who was right. It wasn't about winning an argument or exposing someone's flaws. It was about grace, about responding to rejection with understanding and transforming pain into possibility. His refusal to lash out had set something in motion that no amount of anger ever could. Instead of deepening the divide, his act of kindness had bridged it. Melissa Hargrove had changed, the diner had changed, and so had the entire town. People who once saw each other as strangers had begun to see each other as neighbors again, and it all stemmed from one simple decision: to walk away with dignity and choose compassion. Forgiveness isn't easy. It requires strength. Not the kind of strength that wins fights, but the kind that calms storms. Keanu's story in Maple Creek reminds us that the most powerful thing we can do is to be kind when we have every reason not to be. When Melissa Hargrove denied him service, it would have been easy to make her regret it. He had the fame, the platform, and the public support to call for outrage, to unleash a wave of negativity, but instead, Keanu chose humility. He chose to see Melissa not as an enemy, but as a human being, a person struggling with her own fears, beliefs, and mistakes. By offering grace in that moment, Keanu gave Melissa something far more powerful than punishment. He gave her the opportunity to grow, and she did. She took responsibility, found the courage to apologize, and transformed not just herself, but her community. That's the lesson we can all take from this incredible story. Forgiveness doesn't excuse wrong actions, but it opens the door for healing. It creates a space where understanding can flourish and where second chances aren't just given, they're embraced. When Keanu returned to Maple Creek, he saw a different town. But it wasn't because he forced change, it was because he inspired it. His quiet influence encouraged Melissa to rethink her values, to remember the lessons from her own childhood, and to honor the friendship between her grandmother's generation and Keanu's family. Melissa's open letter became a symbol of redemption. It reached beyond Maple Creek, resonating with people from all walks of life. Her courage to admit her mistakes publicly became a catalyst for others to do the same. And Keanu's unwavering kindness proved that compassion has the power to heal even the deepest divides. The Maple Creek Diner became a place where everyone was welcome. Talia's open mic nights gave voice to people who had long felt silenced. Community dinners brought neighbors together, creating bonds that had frayed over time. And when the park honoring Eliza and Mama Beverly was unveiled, it became a living testament to the power of friendship, empathy, and legacy. And none of it would have happened if Keanu had chosen anger over grace. At the heart of this story lies a simple truth: people make mistakes. We all come from different experiences, different beliefs, and different fears. But when we lead with compassion instead of judgment, we create the possibility for connection. We make it safe for people to admit when they're wrong. We give each other room to change. Keanu Reeves didn't just forgive Melissa. He showed her that she was worth forgiving. He modeled the kind of leadership the world desperately needs: calm, respectful, and focused on healing rather than hurting. And the ripple effect of that choice continues. Businesses in Maple Creek flourished because the town came together. Jesse, a young man who once ran with a rough crowd, found purpose in the diner's kitchen. Children played in a park built on the foundation of old friendships and renewed hope, all because one man chose kindness. If you believe in the power of kindness, if you believe that grace and forgiveness can change lives, then be part of this movement. Hit like if Keanu's story moved you. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that prove one act of grace can change the world. Share this incredible story with friends and family, because the world needs more examples of compassion triumphing over conflict. Let's build more bridges where walls once stood. Let's be the reason someone finds hope again. Because at the end of the day, true strength isn't about proving you're right. It's about choosing to be kind. And as Keanu Reeves has shown us in this story, one act of grace can transform an entire community and inspire the world.